a quiet little town where everyone knew each other, there lived a high school senior who had earned himself quite the reputation. His name was Kevin Doyle, but most people just called him Kev. If you asked anyone about him, they'd describe him as big, loud, and mean, someone you didn't want to cross paths with unless absolutely necessary. Kev wasn't always this way, though. When he was younger, he used to be like any other kid, playing football in the park, laughing at silly jokes, and dreaming of becoming something great someday. But life hadn't been kind to him over the years. His dad left when he was only 8 years old, leaving behind nothing but empty promises and broken photo frames. His mom worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, which meant she was rarely home. Alone and angry, Kev started acting out. At first, it was small things, talking back to teachers or skipping class. But soon, it escalated into something worse. He became the bully everyone feared. Walking through the hallways of his high school felt almost like being an untouchable king. Kids would duck their heads, avoiding eye contact, while teachers tried not to provoke him too much during lessons. Parents whispered warnings to their children about staying away from that Doyle boy. It wasn't that Kev enjoyed making people miserable. Deep down, he hated how lonely he felt. But pushing others around made him feel powerful, even if it was only for a moment. And so, day after day, Kev kept up his act, never realizing how much damage he was doing, not just to others, but to himself. One particularly rough afternoon, Kev found himself sitting outside the principal's office yet again. This time, it was because he got into another fight in the cafeteria. The argument started over something stupid, a spilled drink, but Kev's temper flared instantly, and before anyone could stop him, punches were thrown. By the time the teachers intervened, one student had a bloody nose and Kev was dragged off to face the consequences. The principal gave him yet another suspension, lecturing him about responsibility and respect, but Kev barely listened. All he could think about was how unfair everything was. Why did everyone blame him? Didn't they understand what it was like to carry all this anger inside? Fuming, he grabbed his backpack and stormed out of the building without looking back. He walked aimlessly toward the nearby park. His mind raced with thoughts of revenge. Revenge against the world, against the system, against anyone who dared judge him. The crisp autumn air did little to cool his boiling blood. Leaves crunched under his feet as he wandered deeper into the park, muttering curses under his breath. That's when he saw her, a frail-looking old woman sitting alone on a bench near the pond. She wore a faded floral dress that looked like it belonged to a different era, and her silver hair shimmered faintly in the sunlight. In her hands she held a small bag of breadcrumbs, scattering them carefully for the pigeons gathered around her feet. Something about her peaceful presence irritated Kev. How could someone sit there so calmly while the rest of the world dealt with chaos? He slowed down, watching her for a moment. Then, unable to resist the urge to disrupt her tranquility, he approached her. His heavy footsteps echoed on the pavement, startling the birds which scattered in every direction. The old woman turned her head slightly, squinting up at him. Her eyes were sharp despite her age, and there was a calmness in them that unnerved him. "Can I help you, young man?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a warmth that clashed with Kev's cold demeanor. For a second, Kev hesitated. There was something about the way she spoke, so gentle yet firm, that caught him off guard. But then his usual arrogance kicked in. He curled his lip into a sneer and said, "Yeah, maybe you can shut up and stop wasting space." The words came out harsher than he intended, but he didn't care. He wanted to shake her out of her calm bubble, to make her feel even a fraction of the frustration he carried inside. To emphasize his point, he kicked some of the breadcrumbs away with his shoe, sending the remaining pigeons fluttering into the sky. The old woman flinched slightly but didn't say anything right away. Instead, she stared at him, her expression unreadable. For a brief moment, Kev thought he saw sadness flicker in her eyes, but it disappeared too quickly for him to be sure. That fleeting glimpse unsettled him more than he cared to admit. What was wrong with him? Why did this random stranger's reaction bother him so much? When she leaned forward to pick up her bag, Kev acted on impulse. Without thinking, he grabbed her wrist, squeezing it tightly. "Don't ignore me, old lady," he snapped, his voice rising. What happened next shocked him and changed his life forever. The moment Kev grabbed the old woman's wrist, something inside her seemed to snap. Her calm demeanor vanished in an instant, replaced by a fierceness that made Kev's grip falter. Before he could process what was happening, she twisted her arm with surprising strength, breaking free from his grasp. Then, without hesitation, she swung her cane upward, striking him squarely across the shin. "Ow!" Kev yelped, stumbling backward. Pain shot through his leg, and for a split second, all he could do was stare at her in disbelief. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. People didn't fight back against him, especially not frail-looking old women sitting on park benches feeding pigeons. He expected tears, pleading, maybe even silence if she was too scared to speak. But this was completely unexpected. Mrs. Harper stood up slowly, leaning heavily on her cane but exuding a confidence that made Kev take another step back. Her eyes locked onto his, sharp and unyielding. "Young man," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I've faced worse than you during wartime, and I'll be damned if some punk kid thinks he can push me around." Kev blinked, unsure of how to respond. The words hit him harder than the cane had. Who was this woman? She didn't act like anyone else he'd ever encountered. Most people cowered or ran away when confronted by someone like him. They avoided conflict at all costs, choosing instead to let him have his way. But here she was, standing tall despite her age, refusing to back down. For a brief moment, Kev considered retaliating. After all, he was bigger, stronger, and younger. If he wanted to, he could easily overpower her. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the fire in her eyes or the fact that she hadn't shown even a hint of fear since he approached her. Whatever it was, it left him frozen in place, unable to move or speak. Mrs. Harper took advantage of his hesitation. Instead of walking away or calling for help, she planted herself firmly where she stood, gripping her cane like it was both a weapon and a lifeline. "You think you're tough?" she asked, tilting her head slightly as though studying him. "You think pushing people around makes you strong? Let me tell you something, boy. It doesn't. All it does is make you weak." Her words struck a nerve deep within Kev, though he couldn't quite explain why. Weak? Him? No one had ever called him weak before. People feared him, respected him, or at least pretended to, and did whatever they could to stay out of his way. Yet here was this tiny old woman, daring to call him out, to challenge everything he believed about himself. Before he could form a coherent response, Mrs. Harper continued, "I've seen real strength, son. I've watched men march off to war, knowing they might never come back. I've buried loved ones and raised children alone because life didn't give me a choice. Strength isn't about throwing your weight around or hurting others. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. And trust me, picking on an old woman is about as far from right as you can get." Kev swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. For the first time in years, he felt small, not physically, but emotionally. The anger that had fueled him for so long seemed to drain away, leaving behind only confusion and shame. Mrs. Harper must have noticed the change in him because her tone softened slightly. "Sit down," she said, gesturing toward the bench behind them. "We need to talk." Kev hesitated, torn between defiance and curiosity. Part of him wanted to turn and walk away, to pretend none of this had happened. But another part, the part that had been buried under layers of anger and insecurity, wanted to hear more. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered himself onto the bench, keeping a safe distance between them. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the rustling leaves overhead and the distant chatter of children playing nearby. Kev stared at the ground, avoiding her gaze, while Mrs. Harper leaned on her cane, watching him with a mixture of patience and determination. Finally, she broke the silence. "Tell me," she said gently, Why are you so angry? The question caught Kev off guard. No one had ever asked him that before, at least, not in a way that felt genuine. Teachers lectured him about controlling his temper. Classmates avoided him altogether. Even his mom, when she was home, usually just told him to calm down without really understanding why he acted the way he did. But Mrs. Harper's tone was different. There was no judgment in her voice, no accusation, just honest curiosity. Kev opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. How could he explain something he barely understood himself? Anger had become such a constant in his life that it felt almost natural, like breathing. But as he sat there, staring at the dirt beneath his sneakers, he realized he didn't know where to start. "It's okay," Mrs. Harper said, sensing his struggle. "You don't have to tell me everything right now. But someday, you'll need to figure it out. Because until you do, you'll keep making the same mistakes over and over again." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Kev didn't respond, but for the first time in a long time, he found himself listening. Not just hearing, but truly listening to what someone else had to say. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light across the park, Kev knew one thing for certain: his encounter with this wrong old woman had changed something inside him. Whether it would lead to something good or bad, he couldn't yet say. But one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. Over the next hour, Mrs. Harper did something that no one else had ever done for Kev. She listened. Not the kind of half-hearted listening where people nod along while waiting for their turn to speak, but real, genuine listening. She asked questions, not to pry or judge, but to understand. And slowly, hesitantly, Kev began to open up. At first, his words came out in fragments, disjointed and defensive. He talked about how annoying it was to be constantly lectured by teachers who didn't know anything about him. How frustrating it felt when classmates whispered behind his back, calling him names he tried to ignore. But as Mrs. Harper nodded encouragingly, her eyes never wavering from his face, Kev found himself diving deeper into thoughts and feelings he'd buried long ago. "I don't even know why I do it," he admitted finally, his voice quieter now. "It's like everyone expects me to be this big, scary guy, so I just play along. If they're already afraid of me, then at least I won't get hurt, right? Nobody messes with me if they think I'm gonna punch them." Mrs. Harper tilted her head slightly, studying him with a mixture of sympathy and understanding. "So you push people away before they can push you?" she said softly. It wasn't a question, it was a statement, one that hit Kev harder than any punch ever could. He looked down at his hands clenched tightly together in his lap. "Yeah, I guess so," he muttered. "It's easier than letting anyone get close. People always leave anyway, so what's the point?" For a moment, Mrs. Harper didn't say anything. She simply sat there leaning on her cane, giving him space to process his own words. Then, with a gentle sigh, she spoke again. "You know, I used to feel the same way once," she said. "When my husband passed away, I swore I'd never let anyone else matter to me again. Why bother when they're just going to leave someday? But life has a funny way of proving us wrong." Kev glanced up at her, curiosity getting the better of him. "What happened?" he asked, almost reluctantly. A faint smile crossed Mrs. Harper's lips as she gazed off into the distance, lost in memories. "Well, after my husband died, I threw myself into work. I volunteered at the local shelter, taught art classes to kids, helped neighbors whenever I could. At first I told myself I was doing it because I had nothing better to do. But deep down I think I was trying to fill the emptiness inside me. And somewhere along the way, those people, the ones I thought wouldn't stick around, they became my family. They reminded me that even though we lose people we love, there's still beauty in connecting with others." Kev frowned, unsure of how to respond. Everything she was saying sounded nice in theory, but it didn't seem possible for someone like him. "That's great and all," he said, scratching the back of his neck awkwardly. "But I'm not exactly the friendly type. People don't want to hang out with me unless they're scared of me." Mrs. Harper chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Oh, son, fear isn't the only thing that draws people to you. Sure, it might keep them quiet for a while, but it doesn't make them respect you or care about you. What matters is how you treat others when they're vulnerable. Do you lift them up, or do you tear them down? That's what defines you, not your size or your temper. Her words sank in slowly, like rain soaking into dry earth. Kev had spent so much time building walls around himself that he'd forgotten what it felt like to let someone in. Even now, sitting here with Mrs. Harper, part of him wanted to shut her out, to go back to the anger and isolation that felt familiar. But another part, a small, fragile part, wanted to believe her, to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't doomed to live the rest of his life alone. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the park in shades of orange and pink, Mrs. Harper reached into her bag and pulled out a small slip of paper. She scribbled something on it quickly, then handed it to Kev. "Here," she said, placing it gently in his palm. "This is my phone number. If you ever want to talk or need someone who won't judge you, you know where to find me." Kev stared at the piece of paper, feeling a strange mix of emotions swirl inside him. Gratitude, relief, maybe even hope. He couldn't put a name to it, but whatever it was, it made his chest feel lighter somehow. For the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone. "Thanks," he mumbled, shoving the paper into his pocket. The word felt inadequate, but it was all he could manage. Mrs. Harper smiled warmly, patting his shoulder with her free. "And, you're welcome, dear," she said. "And remember, change doesn't happen overnight. Take it one step at a time." With that, she gathered her things and started walking away, her cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement. Kev watched her go, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over him. As she disappeared around the corner, he realized something important. Meeting Mrs. Harper hadn't been an accident. Something, or someone, had brought them together for a reason. For the first time in a long time, Kev felt like he had a choice. He could keep being the angry, isolated bully everyone feared, or he could try to become something more. Sitting there on the bench, surrounded by the fading light of evening, he decided to take the first step toward change, even if he didn't know exactly where it would lead. The next few days felt strange for Kev. He kept replaying that afternoon in the park over and over in his mind. The way Mrs. Harper had stood up to him, the things she'd said, and the unexpected kindness she'd shown. It was like a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. For years, he'd convinced himself that the world was against him, that people only cared about themselves, and that showing weakness would only get him hurt. But Mrs. Harper didn't fit into any of those beliefs. She wasn't afraid of him. She didn't judge him, and she certainly didn't treat him the way others did. At first, Kev tried to brush it off. Maybe she was just some weird old lady who got lucky with her cane swing, he told himself. Maybe her words didn't mean anything, but deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Something about her had gotten under his skin, and no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to see her again. So on a chilly Thursday evening after school, Kev found himself walking back to the park. He wasn't sure what he was doing or why he even cared, but something pulled him there. When he arrived, he spotted Mrs. Harper sitting on the same bench where they'd met before. This time, though, she wasn't feeding pigeons. Instead, she was sketching in a small notebook, her pencil moving steadily across the page. For a moment, Kev hesitated. What if she didn't want to see him? What if she thought he was wasting her time? But then she glanced up, noticed him standing there, and smiled warmly. "Well, look who decided to show up," she said, patting the space beside her on the bench. "Come sit." Kev shuffled over awkwardly, dropping onto the bench with a heavy sigh. "Hey," he muttered, shoving his hands into his pockets. He felt out of place, unsure of how to act around someone who treated him like a person. Mrs. Harper closed her notebook and turned to face him. "How have you been holding up?" she asked casually, as if they were old friends catching up. Kev shrugged. "Same old stuff, I guess. School's boring, teachers hate me, blah, blah, blah." He paused, glancing at her from the corner of his eye. "But, thanks for letting me come by." She chuckled softly, shaking her head. "You don't need to thank me, dear. I told you. I'm here if you need me. No strings attached." Her words made Kev feel oddly lighter, like maybe he didn't have to carry all his problems alone anymore. Over the next hour, they talked, really talked. Kev opened up more than he ever had before, sharing bits and pieces of his life that he'd kept hidden even from himself. He told her about his dad leaving, about how lonely it felt when his mom worked late shifts, and about the frustration of being labeled a bad kid everywhere he went. Mrs. Harper listened intently, nodding occasionally but never interrupting. When he finished, she leaned back against the bench with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said after a moment, "it sounds like you've been carrying a lot of weight on your shoulders. And I'm not talking about physical strength. You're plenty strong there. I mean emotional weight. The kind that makes you lash out because you don't know what else to do." Kev frowned, chewing on the inside of his cheek. "Yeah, maybe," he admitted reluctantly. "But it's not like I can just turn it off, you know? People already think I'm a jerk. Changing their minds feels impossible." Mrs. Harper nodded, knowingly. "Change doesn't happen overnight, son. Trust me, I've been there. But it starts with small steps. Little choices every day that remind you, and everyone else, that you're capable of more than you think." Over the next few weeks, Kev started visiting Mrs. Harper regularly. Sometimes they'd sit in the park talking about everything and nothing. Other times she'd take him to volunteer at the local shelter, introducing him to people who welcomed him without judgment. At first, Kev felt out of place among the volunteers, worried that someone might recognize him and start gossiping. But Mrs. Harper reassured him, reminding him that actions spoke louder than rumors. One Saturday morning, Kev found himself helping serve breakfast to families at the shelter. It was humbling, seeing parents struggle to feed their kids while trying to hold on to hope. For the first time, Kev realized that he wasn't the only one dealing with pain. These people weren't so different from him. They were just fighting their own battles. As the weeks turned into months, Kev began to notice subtle changes in himself. He still had moments of anger, of course. He wasn't perfect, but they became fewer and farther between. More importantly, he started thinking twice before acting on impulse. Instead of snapping at classmates who annoyed him, he bit his tongue and walked away. Instead of skipping class to avoid trouble, he forced himself to stay and listen, even if the lessons bored him. Word spread quickly in a small town, and soon people began to notice the change in Kev. Some were skeptical, whispering that it was probably just an act. Others gave him cautious smiles, testing the waters to see if he really was different. But slowly, very slowly, Kev earned back a little trust. A classmate thanked him for helping carry books one day. A teacher praised him for turning in an assignment on time. Each small gesture felt like a victory, proof that he was heading in the right direction. Through it all, Mrs. Harper remained a steady presence in his life. She encouraged him when he doubted himself, challenged him when he slipped back into old habits, and celebrated his progress, no matter how minor it seemed. "You're doing better than you realize," she told him one afternoon as they strolled through the park together. "Don't forget to give yourself credit." Kev smiled faintly, kicking a pebble along the path. "I wouldn't be here without you," he said quietly. "You didn't have to help me, but you did." "Why?" Mrs. Harper stopped walking and turned to face him, her eyes soft but serious. "Because everyone deserves a second chance, dear. Even someone like you. Especially someone like you." Her words stayed with Kev long after their walk ended. They reminded him that no matter how far he'd fallen, it was never too late to climb back up. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could build a future worth looking forward to. As the months rolled by, Kev's transformation became harder to ignore, not just for him, but for everyone around him. At first, people were hesitant to trust the change they saw. After all, Kev had spent years building a reputation as someone who thrived on chaos and intimidation. It wasn't easy for others to reconcile that image with the quieter, more thoughtful version of him that began emerging. But Kev didn't let their skepticism discourage him. If anything, it fueled his determination to prove them wrong. One afternoon, during a particularly grueling gym class, Kev noticed a younger student struggling to keep up during a relay race. The kid tripped over his own feet, earning jeers from some of the older boys. Kev recognized the look on the boy's face. It was the same expression he used to wear when bullies picked on him in middle school. Without thinking twice, Kev jogged over and offered the boy a hand. "Hey," he said gently, pulling him to his feet. "It happens to everyone. Don't let those guys get to you." The boy blinked up at him, clearly shocked. Thanks," he mumbled, brushing dirt off his knees. Kev gave him a reassuring nod before heading back to join his team. He didn't think much of the moment, until later, when one of his classmates mentioned it during lunch. "Did you really help that kid today?" the guy asked, raising an eyebrow. Kev shrugged, trying to play it cool. "Yeah, so what?" He needed a hand. His friend stared at him, like he'd grown a second head. "Man, I never thought I'd see the day when you went out of your way to be nice to someone." The comment stung a little, but Kev knew it was true. He hadn't exactly been known for kindness in the past. Still, instead of getting defensive, he smirked. "Guess there's a first time for everything, huh?" Word of the incident spread quickly through the school, and soon enough teachers started noticing too. One day, Mr. Thompson, the history teacher who had written Kev off as a lost cause, pulled him aside after class. "I heard about what you did for that freshman," he said, leaning against his desk. "It's good to see you stepping up, Kev. Keep it up." For a moment, Kev felt a surge of pride swell in his chest. Coming from Mr. Thompson, whose opinion actually mattered, the compliment meant something. "Thanks," he muttered, shuffling his feet awkwardly. "I'm just trying to, do better." Mr. Thompson nodded approvingly. "Well, it shows. Keep proving people wrong, all right?" Meanwhile, Kev's relationship with Mrs. Harper continued to grow stronger. She became more than just a mentor. She was like family, a grandmother figure, who filled the void left by his absent parents. Every weekend he visited her house where she taught him new skills and shared stories from her life. Sometimes they baked cookies together, filling the kitchen with the sweet smell of cinnamon and laughter. Other times they worked on community projects, painting murals or cleaning up local parks. Through these activities, Kev discovered talents he never knew he had, like drawing and woodworking, and found joy in creating something meaningful. But perhaps the most impactful lesson Mrs. Harper taught him was forgiveness. Not just forgiving others, but forgiving himself. One evening, as they sat on her porch watching the sunset, Kev opened up about the guilt he carried for all the pain he'd caused in the past. "How am I supposed to make up for all the bad stuff I've done?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "What if people never forgive me?" Mrs. Harper placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Forgiveness isn't about erasing the past, dear. It's about learning from it and choosing to move forward. You can't change what you've done, but you can control how you live from this point on. Show people through your actions that you're not the same person anymore. That's how you earn their trust back." Her words stayed with him long after their conversation ended. They gave him permission to let go of the shame that had weighed him down for years and focus on becoming the person he wanted to be. By senior year, Kev's efforts began paying off in ways he hadn't anticipated. His grades improved, earning him praise from teachers who once doubted his potential. He joined the peer mentoring program, using his experience to guide younger students who struggled with similar issues. And perhaps most surprisingly, he formed genuine friendships, ones based on mutual respect rather than fear. Of course, there were still challenges. Some classmates remained skeptical, whispering behind his back or testing his patience. But Kev handled each situation differently now. Instead of reacting with anger, he took a deep breath and chose to respond with understanding. More often than not, his calm demeanor disarmed even the harshest critics. When graduation season approached, Kev couldn't believe how far he'd come. Just 2 years ago, he'd been convinced he wouldn't even finish high school. Now, here he was, preparing to walk across the stage and receive his diploma. As part of the ceremony, students were invited to nominate peers for special recognition awards. To Kev's astonishment, his name was called, not for academic excellence or athletic achievement, but for leadership and character development. Standing. On stage under the bright lights, Kev felt a lump rise in his throat as he accepted the award. He scanned the audience, locking eyes with Mrs. Harper, who sat proudly in the front row, clapping enthusiastically. When it came time for his speech, he gripped the microphone tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm not going to lie," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "A few years ago, nobody would have expected me to be standing here. Today, including me, I messed up a lot. I hurt people. I made mistakes I'll regret for the rest of my life. But then, I met someone who changed everything. Someone who believed in me when no one else did, including myself." He paused, glancing toward Mrs. Harper again. "She taught me that strength isn't about pushing people around. It's about lifting them up, about owning your mistakes, and working every single day to be better. So if there's anyone out there listening right now who feels like they've hit rock bottom, I want you to know this. It's never too late to turn things around. Find someone who believes in you, even if it's hard, and hold on to them. Because sometimes all it takes is one person to remind you that you're worth saving." The crowd erupted into applause, many wiping away tears. As Kev stepped off the stage, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. For the first time in his life, he truly believed he deserved a second chance, and he was determined to make the most of it. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of his journey. The graduation ceremony ended with a mix of cheers, hugs, and tearful goodbyes. Kev stood near the edge of the crowd, his diploma clutched tightly in one hand, feeling both proud and overwhelmed. For years, he'd imagined this day as just another milestone to get through, something to check off his list before moving on to whatever came next. But now it felt different. It wasn't just about leaving high school behind. It was about stepping into a future he'd fought hard to build for himself. As the evening wore on, families gathered around to take photos and celebrate. Kev spotted Mrs. Harper standing nearby, her cane resting against her side as she watched the festivities with a content smile. He walked over to her, unable to stop grinning. "Hey," he said, holding out the diploma. "I did it." Mrs. Harper's eyes sparkled with pride as she reached up to pull him into a tight hug. "Of course you did, my boy," she said softly. "You've worked so hard for this moment. Never forget where you started, and never stop helping others do the same." Her words lingered in Kev's mind long after they parted ways that night. They reminded him of the journey he'd been on, the anger, the pain, the mistakes, and ultimately the redemption. But they also planted a seed in his heart, the idea that his story didn't have to end here. If he could change, maybe he could help others do the same. Over the summer, Kev decided to take a gap year before heading off to college. He wasn't entirely sure what he wanted to study yet, but he knew one thing for certain. He wanted to give back to the community that had given him a second chance. With Mrs. Harper's encouragement, he began volunteering at the local youth center, mentoring kids who reminded him of his younger self. Many of them came from broken homes or tough situations, struggling to find their place in the world. Kev understood them better than most adults did because he'd been there too. One afternoon, while leading an art class, Kev noticed a quiet teenager sitting alone in the corner. The kid barely spoke, keeping his head down and avoiding eye contact with everyone. Something about him struck a chord deep within Kev. It was like looking into a mirror from years ago. After class, Kev approached him cautiously, pulling up a chair beside him. "Hey," he said, keeping his tone casual. "You okay?" The boy shrugged, not meeting his gaze. "Yeah, I guess." Kev nodded, letting the silence hang between them for a moment. "Listen, I know things can feel pretty rough sometimes, trust me, I've been there. But if you ever need someone to talk to, or even just hang out with, I'm here." To his surprise, the boy glanced up, studying him carefully. "Why would you care?" he asked bluntly. Kev chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair. "Because I used to be exactly like you. Angry, lost, thinking nobody gave a damn. But then someone proved me wrong. And now, I want to do the same for you." From that day forward, The two formed an unlikely friendship. Kev became a mentor, not just to that boy, but to several others who needed guidance. He shared his own experiences openly, showing them that it was possible to rise above their circumstances. Together they worked on projects, played basketball, and talked about everything under the sun. Slowly but surely, Kev saw glimpses of hope in their eyes, the same kind of hope Mrs. Harper had once sparked in him. Months later, Kev received a letter in the mail. It was from a scholarship committee, congratulating him on being awarded financial aid to pursue higher education. Enclosed with the letter was a note from Mrs. Harper, written in her neat cursive handwriting. "Dear Kev," it read, "this is just the beginning of your journey. Remember, strength isn't about how much weight you can carry. It's about how many people you lift along the way. Make us proud." Tears welled up in Kev's eyes as he folded the note and tucked it safely into his wallet. He realized then that Mrs. Harper had done more than save him from himself. She'd shown him the power of kindness and resilience. She'd taught him that true strength came from using your struggles to help others overcome theirs. When Kev finally left for college later that year, he carried those lessons with him. In his dorm room, he pinned up a photo of himself and Mrs. Harper taken on graduation day, a reminder of how far he'd come and the promise he'd made to pay it forward. His major was undecided, but his purpose was crystal clear: to dedicate his life to making a difference, one person at a time. Years passed, and Kev grew into a man defined not by his past, but by the choices he made every day. He became a counselor, working with troubled teens and guiding them toward brighter futures. Whenever he faced challenges, he thought back to that fateful afternoon in the park, the moment when an old woman refused to back down and changed his life forever. And whenever he doubted himself, he remembered her final piece of advice: "Even the smallest acts of courage can lead to the biggest transformations." Those words stayed with him always, fueling his determination to keep pushing forward. In the end, Kev's story wasn't just about redemption, it was about legacy, about proving that no matter how lost you feel, there's always a path to finding yourself again. And sometimes all it takes is one brave soul to show you the way.